Hello, and welcome to today's keynote presentation. Thank you for coming to hear about this globally important topic. My name is Nicole Pollard, and I am a Principal Strategic Engagement Consultant and part of Medidata's Diversity in Clinical Trials Steering Committee. I am honored and delighted to be moderating today's discussion, Changing the Trajectory of COVID-19 in Communities of Color. Today, we will be speaking with two esteemed industry leaders, Dr. John Whyte from WebMD and Cassandra Smith from Janssen Pharmaceutical, who will share strategies towards patient equity and for engaging racial and ethnic minority populations in COVID-19 trials. When I joined Medidata a year and a half ago, I was excited to unite my love of science, passion for technology, and years of industry experience to provide treatments for people around the world. I never would have anticipated how that mission would take center stage to the way that COVID-19 has transformed our world. Like many of you, the quarantine was a very disruptive reality. And as I hunker down here in my home office, I turn to the science of this disease for clues about how we could better understand why communities of color, in particular Black, Latinx, and Native Americans, have been hit significantly harder than the general population, both in infection and mortality rates, and how we could beat it globally. So what does the data show us? Data on global and US participation rates tell us that globally, when you break down by race, 79% of participants are white, compared to 5% Black and 12% that are Asian. Looking at the US and the rest of the world, breakdown by race and gender, starting at the US, 81% of participants are white, 15% are Black, and although Asians are well represented in foreign trials, they accounted for about 2% of the US-based trials. And then when you look at the rest of the world, there is a marked difference between gender and race, in which 78 of the participants were white, 1% were Black, and 16% were Asian, with 60% being male and 40% being female. We know that Black people, Latinx people, and Asian people are underrepresented relative to their percentage of the population, and often relative to the incidence of the disease that clinical trials address. This has many implications for our industry, for our scientific understanding of the safety and the efficacy of treatments, but more importantly, for the patients that rely on these treatments to save their lives. This was a sobering fact for me. For each percentage marked a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a friend, or another family member that is no longer here with us. So let's start our discussion for today. So John, I'll start with you. You know best about drug trial snapshots from the FDA and who participates in clinical trials. It may be too early to summarize participation data in COVID-19 trials, but we're seeing 3 to 5% or less of African Americans in trials. And we also know that if we found a standard therapy and don't enroll the right populations, that it's going to impact the mortality of that excluded population. So why has the coronavirus, more than any other disease, demonstrated to the world the importance of diversity and inclusion in clinical trials?
Well, first I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And I think what's different is, none of us are surprised that work in public health issues about the disparity that your slide showed about deaths in people of color. But COVID really has put it in the headlines. So everyone can be aware of this information and see how stark it is. And the challenges in terms of COVID are the challenges that we've all known. It's just been more precise. So we've been talking about issues of access to care. For COVID, it's about issues of access to testing. It's issues of access to, fresh fruits and vegetables and, food deserts. It's all the same issues. But COVID-19 really has crystallized it. And the other important point as it relates to clinical trials and drug development is the concept of variability of drug response, how people of different sex, race, age may respond differently to a drug. And we're seeing in the Black community the impact of hypertension and obesity in terms of how they may respond to COVID infection and drug development. And unless we ask if there are differences, we're never, and look for them, we're never going to find them.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Cassandra, we've talked and we've shown today about some of the barriers. Some have talked about some of the cofactors. I thought maybe you could also build a little bit more on what John has just shared and give your point of view of why, again, disproportionately, it has impacted people of color, but also bring about the intersectionality of some of those cofactors and why that has also been a game changer.
Sure, absolutely, Nicole, and thank you for having me for this important discussion. I think Dr. Whyte touched on a lot of the reasons why we're seeing this impact people of color, disproportionately. And the interesting thing is that the same reasons that COVID is, disproportionately affecting these groups, it resonates and it's really the same with why there's lower participation rates in clinical research. If we think about the slide you just shared. I think you can really sum it up with a couple things maybe that I'll highlight for purposes of our discussion today. And it's the comorbidity, piece that Dr. Whyte pointed out, layering that on top of, sometimes there's not the same level of care and access to care within communities of color. So there are food deserts. I think people are becoming more aware of what a food desert is. The same phenomenon really exists when it comes to healthcare. There are healthcare deserts as well in certain communities. So you think about that, being a really driver to the impact in terms of cases and mortality. You layer on top of that the fact that some people within the communities of color are essential workers. A lot of our, essential workers that really are the bloodline for the country and really the operations, that's where they are. They're in communities of color, so they can't social distance. They can't stay home. They can't, work from home in their, home offices and from their computers. They must be in person where the COVID is there. And so I think that also is another piece to it. And one more layer, I think, to the conversation is the multi-generational households that a lot of people of color live in. So there are some vulnerabilities that exist there. So even if grandmom can be at home and to some degree social distance because she's older, she's can stay at home. If the grandchild is out in the grocery store working or out at their job where they're not socially distanced, they come home and we don't know what grandson has. And to Dr. Whyte's earlier point about the lack of testing, there's a gap there where it's not easy to understand what that potentially could do to grandmom and to the other members in the household. So I think there's a lot of different reasons why COVID is affecting communities of color disproportionately.
Yes, absolutely. And to your point that you mentioned about the cohabitation and lack of access, the CDC also has a wonderful reference there, really highlighting that across the communities and how, because they are not able to socially distance, because they do have to still be out in the community and take care of their families and their households, that their rate of mortality, their rate of being hospitalized is so much higher compared to non-Blacks or non-Latinos. And also, of course, unfortunately, the mortality rate that is associated with that is upwards to almost 4 times higher. Recognizing that there really are these health inequities and that they do have structural causes that in some degree warrant policy level solutions, but others, based on what we've learned so far from COVID-19, there are some real lessons here and some actionable targets that we could take for advancing the health equity and improving our pandemic response. So can you share with us how we can broaden what it means to be in clinical trial research? What maybe some impacts that we could consider, maybe from a policy perspective or a financial perspective, and also bringing that back to the patient. How do we transcend maybe some of that burden that they currently are experiencing to then maybe to willingly be a part of a clinical
Yeah.
trial and stay engaged?
And, I also want to address the issue of inequity in clinical trials, specifically as it relates to COVID and as it relates to oncology. Because if you don't participate in a diabetes trial, and we definitely need more people of color in diabetes trial, there's still lots of therapies that you can utilize. But in cancer, if you fail standard treatment and you don't enroll in a clinical trial, that's definitely going to impact your longevity and your quality of life. And it's the same in COVID. If you're not doing well and you're not able to enroll in a clinical trial for monoclonal antibodies or remdesivir or whatever, you're at a disadvantage. So if people of color aren't being enrolled in those trials, that's a challenge, including on vaccine development. But I think what COVID has taught us is that many of the regulations that we had that might have been from good reason. I'll give you that. I'll say that. But we learned we can have flexibility. So there can be more clinical trials in the home, and we should focus on that. Why do you always have to come to the clinic to get a lab, to see the doctor? Many of these could be done by telemedicine and televisits. We can send a phlebotomist to your home to draw blood. Maybe we don't need as many blood draws and other measurements. And we're seeing that on the part of FDA in terms of flexibility. And I think we need to continue to do that. We need to really look at inclusion and exclusion criteria. Some of them simply don't make sense and are based on unconscious racial bias. Let's call it for what it is. And then I think the other issues is in terms of reimbursement. There are a lot of costs of participating in clinical trials that people don't acknowledge. There's the cost of childcare and elder care that you may need to be able to go. There could be loss of work for the day. Everyone isn't able, to take off of work. There are just, we all know, parking costs and other elements, and we need to start addressing those and not putting an economic burden on people that are willing to participate in a clinical trial. We've all talked about it. We have to do things differently if we expect a different outcome, because the number of people in clinical trials for minority groups has not changed much in 20 years, 30 years.
Right.
If we don't do anything differently now, we're not going to see a different outcome. So it's about that flexibility in terms of trial design, and it's about reimbursing patients for some of the routine costs of clinical trials that aren't covered.
Absolutely. And I just want to also just ask you a little bit further. I want to talk about that a little bit further about the reimbursement. As we talk about the clinical trial experience and really having that, beautiful experience of the clinical research, meaning that they will want to be involved in the research, there's an aspect of collaboration there that still needs to be also explored and dealt with as well. And I thought maybe you could just touch upon that just a little bit more.
We've often seen the patients as simply a participant, and they're not really a colleague as part of the trial. And let's be honest, we use them, and then when we're done, we don't have any more communication. And we need to change that and truly make it participatory, whether it's in terms of, utilizing them and figuring out what are the right trial outcomes, making sure they're aware of the results. And as it goes back to, the routine costs, let's also be honest, most clinical trial sites are in urban areas. What does that do for people that live in rural areas or need to travel to a center to participate in a clinical trial that maybe they would have, been willing to do, but they can't afford to be able to travel? So we really need to take a comprehensive look and really recognize the contributions that clinical trial participants are doing, and to really, respect that participation. I know we're making progress, but we can do a lot more.
So as a drug manufacturer, Janssen or any of our colleagues, we can't do this alone. We can, yes, bring the science and bring the innovation and, kind of bring the protocols and the studies to the community. But without the community saying this is something that we, support, this is something that we want to participate in, this is going to be meaningful in terms of the outcomes and what will happen at the end of the research, it's not going to work. And so I think that's something that, again, COVID has really, really helped to underscore the importance of no one stakeholder going at this alone, but really everybody bringing their best together to make it go. So I think that's something that, to the essence of your question, what needs to change, that's one of the things that has to change. And I think we're seeing that now.
Yeah, I completely agree. As we talk about what a clinical trial could be, to inspire values of collective action, disruption, and diversity, undoubtedly, some people will think that maybe some of the proposals or some of the ideas that we have thrown out for today might be a little bit radical. We've even talked about maybe the whole healthcare system needs to be completely disrupted, completely blown up, completely tossed on its head in order for us to really take health equity seriously. I really do believe that now is the time for us to really be thinking big. So my question to both of you is, what barriers to inclusive research can we bring to tackle some of these issues today, right now, so that those that are listening to us today have something tangible that they can take back? And also, we all can be more intentional when we talk about our staffing, when we talk about our study designs, recruitment, and even that post follow-up. As we mentioned, we do a lot of research and we don't always provide that information back out to our communities. So what is it that we can do? And Cassandra, I'll start with you with this one.
Sure. So you said something again that just triggered a thought in me. The intentional, pursuit of diversity. We start there. And it's funny, as I think about the work that we do at Janssen and, the work that many colleagues are doing to diversify their trials, it's like this dichotomy in a sense that people want something that's like earth shattering and groundbreaking and super innovative. But then the solution here is very simple with what it is we're trying to do, right? Like we're trying to make sure that people feel included. We're trying to make sure that we're being intentional with, our pursuit of diversity. We're trying to make sure that we're forming relationships and not, being transactional. When we need something, we're there. When we don't, we're out. It's very simple, I think, foundational ways of working and ways of, kind of being and relating that's going to change this. So I don't know that I have like this grand scheme of like, we should do this. I think there's space to that, or space for that rather. But I actually think that if we take a second and think about what are the things that we could be doing that we're not currently doing and change that, we'll see some change. And again, like the example that Dr. Whyte gave earlier, and I spoke to a little bit in the last question, something as simple as inclusion exclusion criteria and looking at that objectively to make sure that we're not creating barriers for people. You can layer that on with transportation. You can layer that on to, access to clinical studies and, where we're placing our research. If we start with those basic things, I think we will see a radical shift, the radical shift that we need. So I don't have anything groundbreaking for you, Nicole, but I think it's, simplicity is really a key that's going to help us get where we need to be. And it will also, kind of lend itself to some of these bigger, better, bolder ideas because we've not really gotten through foundations. So, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, what you're saying here resonates with me because it's really about awareness. How are we informing? How also are we showing up? The access, and also how that will then lead to equity and that sustainable change. John, so if we do show up better, right? If we do take a concerted effort, we are more intentional, we are more committed. what else is it going to take to have the new gold standard in healthcare and clinical trial participation?
Yeah, but I think it does go back to there has to be a commitment to diversity. And I think we have to acknowledge everyone doesn't agree that there needs to be diversity of clinical trials. Some people feel it just needs to be, quickest to the market and we'll deal with that later. And we need to change that mindset. And we need to move away from all these aspirational goals and have true commitment. So what are we doing at clinical trial sites? What are sponsors requiring? I'm not saying that it should be proportionality or quota, but we really need to also have some accountability as people make the commitment. And everything just can't always be a goal, and then people always miss a goal, and then nothing changes. But I think to your point, fundamentally, the discussion then moves to variability of drug response. Why might you and I differ in how we respond to a drug? And that really relates back to the mission of the FDA and what everyone wants. Everyone wants. We want safety, we want safe drugs, and we want efficacious drugs. And we have lots of data to show that it can vary based on different factors. And that's where we should move the science. And that's what's going to guide it, that we have much more a science-based approach to diversity. There's the social element that's important, and social justice and equity. But there's also the scientific aspect as well that we're learning more and more about.
Absolutely agree, which again goes back to my opening remarks. It was all about the science for me and really understanding some of those dynamics and really looking at the diaspora of people in general across the world and how COVID-19, and also you brought up oncology, but any other disease, you have to look at each person individually and to a point of actually really looking down to the cellular level, down to the DNA. How is that mechanism of action going to be? And I think when we, again, bring back and meld the data that we all have acquired and we know and have researched, and again, bring the science back into the forefront, always still thinking of our patients first, I do think that we will be able to make a paradigm shift in how we think about clinical trials, but also how we intentionally approach clinical trials so that in the end we are bringing.
And say, I hope we do, because we started off with COVID. So here we have historical record of cancer, triple negative breast cancer, prostate cancer, variants that disproportionately impact people of color. And look who participates in those clinical trials that are global. It's not people of color. And we talked about COVID in terms of disproportionately impacts people of color. And there's a struggle and a challenge in getting people of color to enroll in a vaccine trial. So this is where I think it goes to, we have to do things differently and we have to make a commitment. And we have an example right in front of us. And what are we doing about it? And people have said they want to enroll people of color. So where are we on this, and how are we doing better, and how are we improving it? And we say there's a commitment to the elderly. Is it just white elderly patients? Is it just white elderly men? We would never say that's allowable anymore if we just enrolled white men. So why is it okay to enroll a very small percentage in a disease that disproportionately impacts a segment of the population?
Right.
Yeah. And if I could add one other thing, sorry,
yes.
I know I think what you said, Dr. Whyte, is exactly right. If we don't get this right now, I'm not sure what it's going to take, because we have a whole history of conditions where there's disproportionate, representation in terms of like the epidemiology, right? But if you look at the trials, they're also they're not the same people who are affected are not the ones participating. And I feel like with COVID, we now have a platform that we've just never had before. If you think about it, clinical trials, clinical research is almost a household word because it's all over the news. It's on the lips of our leaders. When has that ever happened? Like in the way, in the space that everybody is looking at the COVID-19 vaccine and the trials that are, in development or in process for the development of the vaccine. We just have never had this time. If we can't get it right now, I don't know
Yeah,
what it's going to take. So I completely agree.
I
Completely agree
right.
with you.
it's not like you have
We
to
have to
look
we have to
hard
see.
to find people that are impacted. Yeah.
Right.
And that was the point I was going to say. The reason why it's on everybody's lips and it's at your dinner table and your breakfast table, because it's you. It's you, it's me. We are clinical trials to a certain degree, or we may need to be part of a clinical trial. And as we know, regardless of your race or ethnicity, if you want to ensure that the next vaccine, the next treatment, the next efficacious medicine really does work on your patient population, and especially those that are so adversely affected. Absolutely. Well, our time is coming near, and it's clear that we have a lot of work still to do, and we could probably talk about this for another hour. But we have to conclude for today. But the main thing I want to resonate or reiterate, excuse me, again, were some of the key things that both of you have said in terms of how do we think about this. That if you want diversity in clinical trials, we all need to be committed and truly committed to diversity in clinical trials. And how we define that may be slightly different for everyone, but we need to start in order for us to narrow the diversity gap. And we have to involve the patients that are most in need for increased survival and really focus on those patient-centered outcomes. And how are we doing that? I heard through both of you by trust, collaboration, understanding of cofactors, understanding the populations that we serve and how we and who we don't serve and why we don't serve them. And if we start there, and as you said, Cassandra, if we start simple, there's no grand answer here, but I even think with the strategies that you've shared with us today, there's something that we can all take and be leaders in changing this environment that we are in today. I really want to thank you both for taking the time to share your insights and really helping us and helping me definitely to think differently about diversity, but also some strategies for drug development and remembering that patients are really first in all that we do. So again, I want to thank you all who have joined us today. Thank you, Medidata, for this amazing opportunity that we've had to have this open and honest dialogue. I'd like to invite you to please join us, Medidata's Diversity in Clinical Trials Steering Committee members and our esteemed presenters from today will be in the Innovation Lounge to connect and answer any questions you may have. We look forward to chatting with you and to continue this discussion. Thank you.